am originally a German economist, so I'm pessimistic by nature and profession, but I do have quite extensive background on the Scottish issue, so I will be focusing in my comments on EU issues, but I am also on record about the relationship between Scotland and the EU if Scotland votes yes. So if there are questions about that afterwards, I'm happy to answer them. I will, however, comment directly on the other big constitutional issue, which is the relationship of the UK with the EU, because I think it is one which doesn't get enough attention at the moment. So I will try to give a very, very quick potted history of where the EU is at the moment and what will happen next. And then I will try to make 10 points, which I think are of relevance to Scotland, if I can manage within the time I've got. So where are we at within the EU? We have gone collectively through the worst period the EU has experienced. It has been an incredibly deep economic crisis. It has created a lot of collateral damage. There's a lot of trust which has been damaged between countries, between citizens and the EU. And there's a lot of questioning about the long-term direction of the EU. That comes after a period when already, from a socio-economic point of view, the EU was under severe challenge. We are facing a number of different long-term trends, which all mean that Europe will have to do things differently in future. I don't have time to go into these in great detail, but just to mention them, demographics is one of the common themes when you look across Europe. The aging of Europe's populations is rapid. We're not the only region in the world where this is happening, but certainly it will have a big impact on how the European economy and how European society will work. Globalization has already been mentioned. The reality of global competition, I think, is clearly there. There's also a global competition now for resources. We have to be aware that when you look at resources such as energy, but not just energy, I mean, we are talking about competition for resources across the board, and there are very aggressive players in the game. In some areas, we are starting to now see competition for resources such as water. So it is a key feature of the coming years. And finally, I think one of the long-term challenges which has been aggravated by the crisis is inequalities. We have seen inequalities grow within countries. Certainly in most countries, inequalities have gone up during the crisis, but also between countries. We should never forget that there are some countries which are still suffering greatly from the crisis, where inequality is continuing to increase. And finally, the challenge we are also facing is the climate change and the environment challenge, which we shouldn't forget, despite the fact that it has somewhat dropped off the agenda at the European level. So with these long-term challenges, the European crisis has been a severe negative impact on the European Union and on its member states. And unfortunately, while I would like to be able to say it, the crisis is not over. It has just shifted in terms of where it is now. The one part of the crisis which is over is the currency crisis, the euro crisis. There is no question anymore that the euro will survive this crisis. It is that part of the debate is over. And we can actually see that more countries are joining the euro. I think in the long run we will see a euro area which will be virtually all of the European Union. It will not happen within the next couple of years, but if we're looking at 5, 6, 7 years, then the euro area will be almost synonymous with the European Union, with of course one big exception being the UK. I think the areas where clearly the crisis is not over yet is the public finance and the debt crisis. We are still in a situation where countries have unsustainable levels of debt, and they are increasing. Deficits are still far too high in most countries. There are exceptions to this, which color the overall picture. Germany is probably the biggest exception at the moment, and because of its weight, it has a big influence on the overall picture. But in most countries, we still see a deterioration. We continue to have a banking crisis. The banking crisis, again, has shifted a bit in its nature. We are not facing at the moment a collapse of any banks because of the recapitalizations which have taken place. But we are facing a lending crisis. Banks are not lending, particularly not to SMEs in crisis countries, which means that these countries are losing economic potential for the future. We have a dual economic growth crisis. We have an overall level of growth which is far too low. We should be growing far stronger coming out of a crisis than we are at the moment. But we also have continuing divergence. There are some countries in Europe which are getting poorer rather than converging towards the richer countries. And we also have a massive social crisis in a lot of countries. The unemployment levels, and particularly youth unemployment levels in many countries, are unacceptably high. And that also has an influence on the political crisis we're facing, and we've seen in the European Parliament election the mood of anti-Europeanism, anti-mobility, anti-migration, anti-establishment gaining a lot of ground. And this will have a long-term impact, not so much at the European level, but far more at the domestic policy level. We will see a number of mainstream parties starting to try to shift to cover the ground of these parties. And finally, as if we had not enough crisis, we have an external crisis as well. The Ukraine is one of the big challenges Europe faces. So while we have done a lot, there have been a lot of changes at the European level. I haven't got time to go through all of them, but in terms of governance, in terms of support mechanism, in terms of further integration, a lot has happened. It is still not enough. More will happen in future. But when you hear this unrelenting list of crises, a lot of people have asked whether the European Union is still relevant. And my answer to that is it is actually far more relevant than it has ever been before. So these are 5, I guess, theses, I would say, where I think Europe still matters very much and where it has a local impact. Firstly, the process of globalization, the process of the nature of the challenges which we are facing means we have to have European integration. Europe is the only level which can deal with these challenges. There are a number of challenges which cannot be solved at the national or at the regional level. Whether these are challenges around trade, and if we look at just one example, the negotiations with the United States on a transatlantic trade and investment partnership could not be done by an individual country. Whether they are challenges around the single market, whether they're challenges around investment, I'm not suggesting that we necessarily already have the answers to what we should do there, but I think it is very clear that this is the only level at which we can deal with them. Which is, and that's my first comment on this constitutional issue about whether the UK will stay in the European Union or not. This is the reason why it is utterly idiotic to talk about UK outside the European Union. It is the worst thing the UK could do. It would mean a huge loss of economic and political integration. And the warning has to be out does actually mean out. You cannot have a halfway house. The European Union is not a free trade area. It is a single market with a political integration process. You cannot have a halfway house. And if people would like to look at what a halfway house might look like, they just need to go and talk to people in Norway, in Switzerland, in Turkey, which I experience what it means to be out at the moment. Secondly, I think when we talk about internationalization, we should talk about Europeanization first. Internationalization should start at the European level. These are long-established relationships we have with countries, with regions across Europe. So when we are asking about the global supply chains, where are regions, countries like Scotland integrated in the European supply chains? Where are they working with German firms, which are very clearly successful in the international supply chains? So for me, the first step in any internationalization strategy should be the European neighbors. Thirdly, we will continue to see a Europeanization of a number of policy areas. We have already seen that public spending has become a much more European issue. This is having knock-on effects in a number of different areas, in social areas, in any area where you have significant public spending. We are seeing that certain areas, such as education, are becoming more Europeanized. We are seeing that areas such as energy, clearly with the external challenge we are having, will become more Europeanized in the coming years. So to make a difference on these policies, you have to be engaged with the European policy process. Fourthly, I think what is already clear in many areas is that European governance is starting to constrain local, regional, national room for maneuver. There are, for example, increasingly strict public spending limits. These public spending limits are not something which can easily be set aside even for those countries outside the euro area. It's even more strict for countries within the euro area. It's even more strict for the countries which have to follow a program, like Greece, for example. But it is still having an impact also on the rest of the Union. But beyond that, and it was interesting in the previous talk, one of the areas which was mentioned was competition policy. Of course, there is a European competition policy which overrules national or regional considerations. So to make any changes to competition policy, you have to engage at the European level, not at the national level, because European policy overrules any national considerations on competition policy, public procurement, etc. I think what we are going to see is a further integration in a number of areas, driven by the euro area. That might mean for those countries outside the euro area that there will be exceptions, opt-outs, different arrangements. But there's also a price which is being paid for that. And I think that is one of the things which any country and region in Europe has to consider. You can choose between the constraints which come with euro area membership or a degree of marginalization which comes from being outside. I think this is the reality of where we're going. Finally, and this is probably trying to be a bit more upbeat, we shouldn't forget that there are a lot of opportunities still at the European level. These opportunities, in my view, go way beyond funding, even though the funding is still an important component, especially the funding which is now coming through alternative financial instruments rather than the classical grant route. But I think the other area where there are a lot of opportunities are areas of policy development. There is now a real discussion, for example, about a European industrial policy, which will have an impact on a number of national policies, which will have an impact on a number of other policy areas, such as competition policy, procurement policy, research policy. So I think these are the kind of areas where there are a lot of benefits from engaging. Now, I also wanted to make a few more general points about the current situation as I see where we are in Europe in relation to the rest of the world and what that might mean for economic development. Let me firstly say, and that's again a negative point, but I think we have to realize how severe the resource constraints are which we're facing now. It does mean that we have a severe limit on public funds, whether these are investment funds, whether these are taxation. Yes, there's some room for maneuver in some areas, but overall we are living in a much, much more constrained world. And we shouldn't forget that also on private funds, there are far more constraints. Capital is not flowing very freely. Investment is now much more competed for at a global level. So what does that mean? I think it means we have to make many more hard choices. And the way I would put it is in most of the policy areas we're thinking about, I wouldn't necessarily talk about what more we can do. I would talk about what can we do less. What are the areas where we have the least impact if we're doing less. Secondly, governance and governments matter again. There was an economic paradigm for a long time that governments don't really matter. You deregulate the market and then it will solve itself. Clearly, we've seen this does not work. So governments and governance more generally is having a big impact again in economic policy. But I think we have to move away from seeing governments simply as public spending agencies. We need to have a new paradigm which looks at setting the right framework conditions, which looks at creating a common framework, and I think here again I would say it is at the European level rather than at the national level. And we also need to have a real focus on investment, on future producing investment, and I fully agree that a lot of the spending has been labeled as investment. No, it has to be something which really produces something, and we need to have much better evidence about what kind of spending actually produces positive long-term outcomes. Thirdly, on the nature of globalization, I think globalization is here to stay. There is a very important distinction between tradable and non-tradable sectors, but that distinction is going to reduce over time. We're going to see more and more areas becoming tradable. We're seeing more and more services which can actually be conducted remotely. And in those areas where they are not tradable, we will see more migration, because that is the corollary of the trading of goods and services. We have seen that production, manufacturing, whichever way we want to put it, matters. It actually matters a lot whether you make something, and I think that is one of the areas where a lot of countries are now thinking about how they can maintain a viable production sector within their country. And we've seen that technology matters when you look at productivity, particularly digital technology matters hugely. The productivity increases we've seen in the more advanced economy have been driven by digital technology. So this is an area where countries cannot afford to fall behind. This nature of globalization, I think, is going to continue. I had an interesting chat with someone who looks into future technology, and he said something to me which I found slightly frightening, but quite accurate. If you look at computing power, then you have to look at the kind of exponential development you see in the speed and the processing power of computing. That means that anything computers can do very badly at the moment, in 10 years' time, they will do better than humans. So anything a computer can do badly just now, in 10 years' time, it will overtake human capability. Now that is a huge change in the way our economies work, because if you look at the kind of things computers can do badly now, the kind of things you can start to do with data, it is a huge area of development. It could be, for example, there are incredibly interesting trials on medical diagnostics. It shocks people because nobody believes that in the end a computer will be better than a human in analyzing illnesses, but we will be there. We will be there very soon. If you had asked people 30 years ago whether computers can fly planes, they would have said no, well, they are flying them every day. This is the kind of development we are going to see in many areas. And it means that in terms of economic development, we will have fewer and fewer jobs, at least in advanced economies, at the lower end of the skill set, because these are the kind of jobs which are very easily transferable to automation. So we are going to have a divisive economy where you will have some people who work in globally competitive sectors and a number of people who don't. And that means we have to do more to invest also in those people to bring them into that type of economy. We also have to recognize that when we're talking about global competition, when we're talking about tradable sectors, it is not enough to be just good enough to be a little bit better. You're talking about global excellence. You have to be at the top of the tree. You have to be able to compete with the key the global competitors on a number of areas. And that is a huge challenge because it means an unrelenting focus on quality. It means that you have to have a real focus on the specialisms you have. You have to invest in the specialisms and you have to invest massively in human capital. And there, I think it's one of those areas where we have been talking about investing in human capital for at least 20 years, and we haven't done it. When you look at what countries have actually done, some countries have done it, and some countries have done it even in the middle of a crisis, and those countries have reaped the benefits. I think the example I always use, there are a few, but the example I usually use is Finland. Finland, when the Soviet Union collapsed, went through a tremendously difficult period. It had a huge deficit. It had growth rates, well, negative growth. It had decline, which was far greater than what most countries experienced in the current crisis. And Finland, throughout that period, increased its spending on two areas, education and innovation. It's the only two areas which they increased spending on. Everything else was cut. And that's the kind of hard choices which I think we have to make if we are serious about having these kind of excellent industries which can compete with the rest of the world. If you look at Finland now, it is a very, very interesting case study because despite of the collapse of Nokia, which most people expected Finland would suffer far more from than it has, Finland is actually doing rather well. Why is it doing well? Because of the education and entrepreneurial spirit of its citizens. Out of the ashes of Nokia, there are hundreds of new firms. So that's the kind of example which I think we should be looking at the European level. Finally, on public services, I think it is absolutely critical that public services become a source of competitive advantage. In Europe, we have a very strong attachment to public services. I don't think there's any public will to move to a situation like in the US or in other places where these are cut. But to be able to maintain them in light of the challenges I've mentioned, we have to look at them differently. I think that public services in those countries where they function well are a source of competitive advantage. If you have a well-functioning education system, if you have a well-functioning health system, not only are you enhancing the human capital of the people you have, you're also attracting people to come to your country to be part of that system. But that means you have to improve the quality. And you have to have much more of a focus in public services on what works and what doesn't work, and experiment as well. And that, I think, is very difficult. We have a risk-averse mentality in most countries, but we need to experiment more. And again, just to mention one example, I think one of the things which is extremely important in terms of public services is a shared sense of purpose, an ability to focus on delivering a particular thing. And the example I would use here is Ireland. At the beginning of the period, where we shouldn't forget that Ireland had a dreadful economy for a good 50 years before it started to develop into a good economy. And at the beginning of this period, the one thing which I think was the game changer in Ireland is that there was a consensus between government, between the main players, between education, that there needed to be a focus on attracting inward investment. So the Irish government talked to the global investors and said, what do you want? What is it you need? And there was one famous case, which is well documented, where one of the big IT companies said, we need 20,000 IT graduates. So the Irish government went to all the education institutions in Ireland and asked them, how many IT graduates do you have? And can you please give us a list with their names? And they went back to this company and said, we have 20,000 graduates, and here are their names. And this company invested. And it's that kind of focus which you need to really drive the economic development in a country. So these are just some thoughts. I will make one final comment. I think this kind of focus, this kind of common purpose matters a lot, and I think we see that in a number of countries. The idea that you actually have to have social partners cooperating, I think is a very important concept, cooperating with each other and with government. But I wouldn't also completely disregard the question of competences. What powers there are also matters. You have to have the instruments to be able to do certain things. And I think we are going to see more and more competences and powers to shift to the EU level because the challenges are too interrelated, they are too big to deal with at the national or regional level. I think also in a globalized economy, you have to be part of a bigger entity. So it's important to be open, but you also need a common framework, and I think the EU provides that. So whatever Scotland decides on the 18th of September, I think engagement with the EU is crucial, and I think there Scotland can actually do a lot more. And however many flaws the EU has, I think it is better to be in than out. So I think despite the fact that I said I wouldn't comment on the Scottish question, I think that brings it back to the Scottish question. So people need to make a decision on what they think the probabilities are for Scotland to be inside the European Union, whether they vote yes or no. Thank you.